The heat was a physical presence at Quantico's Advanced Marksmanship and Doctrine Center. It pressed down from a bleached white sky, shimmered in oily waves above the packed earth of the firing line, and baked the metallic scent of spent brass and cleaning solvent into the very air. It was a weight, a test of endurance before the first round was ever chambered. For the elite operators gathered for the annual Trident qualification, it was just another variable in a complex equation of gravity, wind, and human limitation. They were the best of the best. Marine Scout snipers, Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, men carved from granite and forged in the crucible of modern warfare. Their conversation was a low rumble of technical jargon and shared history, a comfortable language of ballistic coefficients and combat drops. At the center of this gathering, holding court like a king in his throne room, was Gunnery Sergeant Rex Thorne. Thorne was a roaring bonfire of a man, built on a scale that seemed to defy regulation. His arms were thick as pythons, covered in a tapestry of faded tattoos that chronicled a career of violence. His voice was a gravelly boom that needed no amplification, a tool he used to command, to cajole, and to crush. He was the chief instructor, a legend in his own mind, and to the younger Marines who orbited him like eager moons, a legend in fact. His M110 SAS, a marvel of modern engineering with a Schmidt and Bender optic the size of a small telescope, lay on its bipod before him, a gleaming black scepter of his authority. The ghost wind shot, he was pontificating, a grin splitting his sun-weathered face. They say it's impossible. They say you can't read a crosswind that switches direction 3 times over 2,000 meters. I say they just haven't got the right gear, or the right man behind it. He slapped his chest, and the junior Marines chuckled on cue, their admiration a palpable force. 30 yards away, tucked into the shade of a maintenance shed, a figure existed in a different universe. She was so still, so unassuming, that she might as well have been a piece of discarded equipment. Sergeant Anya Petrova was cleaning a rifle. To the casual observer, she was an anomaly, a clerical error. She was small, with a lean, wiry frame, lost in oversized fatigues. Her face was plain, her expression neutral, her hands moving with an unnerving, deliberate economy. She was listed on the roster as a data analyst from the Doctrine Command, temporarily assigned to observe and collate performance metrics. A librarian, as Thorne had loudly dubbed her on the first day. Her rifle was as out of place as she was. It was not a sleek modern semi-automatic. It was an M40A5, a bolt-action relic by the standards of the men on the line. But it was not a standard-issue M40. It was worn in ways that spoke not of neglect but of obsessive use. The stock was scarred and smoothed by countless hours of contact with cheek and shoulder, the bluing on the barrel worn thin near the muzzle. It looked less like a weapon and more like a luthier's instrument, an extension of its user. She wasn't scrubbing it, she was tending to it, her movements precise and reverent, as she adjusted a small, almost invisible tensioning screw near the receiver. She was calibrating its harmonics, a concept so arcane that most on the line would have dismissed it as superstition. Chief Petty Officer David Chen, a SEAL with eyes that missed nothing, watched her from a distance. He was a quiet man, his competence a self-evident truth that required no announcement. He had noticed her on the first day. While Thorne and his acolytes were engaged in performative gear checks, she had spent an hour simply walking the range, crumbling the dirt between her fingers, watching a piece of thread she held up to gauge the subtle shifts in the air. She didn't look at the windsocks. She looked at the mirage, the sway of a single blade of grass 100 meters out, the dance of dust devils at the far end of the course. Chen recognized the language. It was the language of mastery, a dialect spoken by very few. He saw not a librarian, but a predator in its natural habitat, perfectly still, perfectly aware. The inciting incident when it came was as predictable as the sunrise. Colonel Marcus Vance, the base commander, had announced that this year's Trident qualification would have a new mandatory component. A single data point from the test would be used to validate a new predictive ballistics algorithm being developed by Doctrine Command. A murmur of discontent went through the operators. They were warriors, not lab rats. Thorne saw his opening. He strode over to Petrova's quiet corner, his shadow falling over her like a shroud. The chorus of junior Marines followed, sensing a spectacle. "Well, well, librarian," Thorne's voice boomed, dripping with condescension. "You getting all the data you need for your little science project? Hope you're taking good notes on how real operators handle their business." Anya Petrova did not look up. Her hands continued their meticulous work on the rifle's trigger assembly, a tiny jeweler's screwdriver moving with surgical precision. "The data is incomplete until all variables are accounted for, Gunnery Sergeant," she stated, her voice soft but clear, utterly devoid of inflection. It was a simple statement of fact. This lack of a flustered, intimidated response was a splash of gasoline on the fire of Thorne's ego. He was being denied the deference he believed was his due. He gestured dismissively at her old rifle. "What is that thing, anyway? A museum piece? You planning on fighting the Kaiser with that? This is a serious training environment, sweetheart. We're using million-dollar systems here. Maybe you should take your little toy and go back to the library before you get hurt." She finally paused. She looked up, her gray eyes meeting his for the first time. They were calm, ancient things, and for a split second, Thorne felt an unfamiliar flicker of uncertainty. It was like looking into the eyes of a wolf. There was intelligence there, but it was alien, unconcerned with his posturing. "It is a purpose-built tool, Gunnery Sergeant," she said, her voice still unnervingly flat. "It is adequate for the task." "Adequate?" Thorne barked a laugh, the moment of uncertainty gone, replaced by renewed arrogance. "Adequate doesn't cut it out here. Only perfection matters." He turned to his audience. "See? This is the problem with letting REMFs and pencil pushers out of their cages. They don't get it. They think war is a spreadsheet." He turned back to her, leaning in, his voice dropping to a theatrical, menacing whisper. "This is my range, Sergeant, and you are a guest who is becoming a distraction. Pack your things. Your observation is over." Anya Petrova held his gaze for another long moment. Then she gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. She did not argue. She did not protest. She simply returned her attention to her rifle, her movements resuming their steady, unhurried rhythm. She had not been dismissed. She had merely acknowledged his input, filed it away, and continued her work. Her utter lack of reaction was a greater insult to Thorne than any curse could have been. It was a denial of his power. He stood there, fuming, his victory feeling strangely hollow. He had won the confrontation, but he had a sinking feeling that he had already lost something far more important. He stormed back to the firing line, his voice even louder than before, desperate to reassert the dominance that had just been so quietly and completely undermined. The Trident qualification began under the oppressive eye of the midday sun. It consisted of 3 shots, each designed to test a different fundamental aspect of marksmanship at the highest level. They were not merely difficult, they were designed to be diagnostic, to strip away the crutches of technology and expose the raw skill, or lack thereof, of the shooter. The first shot was thread the needle. At 1,000 meters, a steel target was placed behind a sheet of bulletproof glass with a 4-inch circular hole cut in its center. The shot required absolute mechanical precision. Any error in calculating the rifle's trajectory, any flaw in the shooter's form, and the round would harmlessly splash against the glass. It was a pure test of cold-bore accuracy and the shooter's ability to build a perfect, stable position. The second was the cold-bore prophet, a 2,000-meter shot on a man-sized target. The challenge was the wind. The range at Quantico was notorious for its fickle breezes, which swirled and eddied through the low hills. But for this shot, the true test was the first round. There were no sighters, no walking the rounds onto the target. The shooter had to make a single perfect wind call based on observation and experience, and deliver a single perfect shot from a cold barrel, which often has a slightly different point of impact than a warm one. It was a test of instinct and mastery of environmental reading. The third, and most infamous, was the ghost wind. This was the shot Thorne had been boasting about. A final 2,000-meter shot, but this time the target was smaller, and the firing lane was deliberately chosen to cross 3 distinct valleys, each with its own microclimate. The wind could be blowing left to right in the first valley, right to left in the second, and straight at the shooter in the third. It was a chaotic, unsolvable puzzle of atmospheric pressures. Success was considered less a matter of skill and more a matter of sheer dumb luck. No one had successfully hit the ghost wind target in the 3 years since its introduction. It was the test's gatekeeper, its soul crusher. Gunnery Sergeant Thorne was the first to shoot. He swaggered to the firing mat, a vision of tactical perfection. He settled in behind his gleaming M11, the rifle looking more like a piece of mobile artillery than a sniper's tool. He went through his motions with a practiced theatrical flair, each movement designed to be observed and admired by the gallery of younger Marines. He addressed the first shot, thread the needle, with contemptuous ease. He spent minutes adjusting his dials, consulting his ballistic computer, and announcing his calculations to anyone within earshot. 10.2 mils of elevation, zero point 0.3 right for spin drift, easy day. The rifle boomed, a deep thoracic concussion. A moment later, the satisfying ping of lead on steel echoed back. A perfect center punch. Thorne allowed himself a smug smile. Next, the cold bore profit. The 2,000-meter distance stretched the capabilities of his 7.62 millimeter round. He spent longer on this one, his eyes scanning the mirage, his brow furrowed in concentration. The wind was tricky, a steady 10-mile-per-hour crosswind that seemed to gust unpredictably. "Reading 6 on the hold," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "Gusting to 8? He made his adjustments, took a deep, calming breath, and squeezed the trigger. The recoil shoved his shoulder. For long seconds, there was only the hiss of the wind. Then, faint but clear, another ping, a hit. It was low and to the left, but it was on steel. A round of applause, led by his acolytes, broke out. Thorne stood up, stretching theatrically. "See? It's all about the math." Then came the ghost wind, the final test. Thorne settled back into his prone position. His confidence, which had been a tangible force, now seemed a little more brittle. He stared downrange through his powerful optic for nearly 10 minutes, his jaw tight. The mirage was a boiling river of distorted air. The windsocks at different intervals pointed in contradictory directions. It was pure chaos. "This is a joke," he grumbled, loud enough for the range officer to hear. "This isn't a marksmanship test, it's a lottery." He finally settled on a wind call, a compromise between the conflicting data. It was more a guess than a calculation. He held his breath and fired. The shot was swallowed by the vastness of the range. There was no impact sound, no puff of dust near the target. The round had been taken by the wind, tossed aside like a piece of chaff, landing harmlessly somewhere on the distant hillside. Thorne cursed, a loud, sharp string of profanities. He slammed his fist into the dirt. "Damn it! The wind shifted at the last second. That gust came out of nowhere. This test is flawed. It's impossible. No human being can make that shot." He stood up, projecting an air of righteous indignation, turning his failure into an indictment of the test itself. It was a masterful piece of ego preservation, and the younger Marines nodded in agreement. If the great Gunny Thorne couldn't make the shot, then it truly couldn't be made. Up in the observation tower, Colonel Marcus Vance watched the proceedings through a high-powered spotting scope. He was a lean, graying man whose quiet demeanor masked a mind as sharp and unforgiving as a shard of glass. He had seen Thorne's performance, heard his excuses. He had seen it all 1,000 times before. The triumph of ego over excellence. The loud pronouncements of men who measured their worth in decibels rather than deeds. He had also been watching the woman in the shade of the maintenance shed. He had read her file, not the thin, sanitized version in the exercise roster, but the real one. The one that was so heavily redacted it was mostly black ink, the one kept in a secure vault at Langley and the Pentagon. He keyed the microphone for the range-wide public address system. His voice, calm and measured, cut through the air, silencing all chatter. "Gunnery Sergeant Thorne, thank you for that demonstration," Vance said, a subtle edge of ice in his tone. "Please clear the firing line." Thorne looked up, surprised, a flicker of unease crossing his face. Vance paused for a beat, letting the silence hang in the hot air. Then he said, "Sergeant Petrova, you're up." A wave of stunned disbelief washed over the assembled operators. It was one thing for the librarian to be on the range. It was another thing entirely for the colonel himself to call her to the line. It had to be a joke, a strange form of mockery. Thorne scoffed openly, shaking his head as he walked off the mat. "You've got to be kidding me, Colonel." The junior Marines snickered, nudging each other. Anya Petrova showed no reaction. She simply placed her tools in her kit, picked up her old rifle and a small, worn shooting mat, and walked toward the firing position Thorn had just vacated. Her walk was as economical as her other movements, a steady, unhurried pace. She was a small island of calm in a sea of confused masculinity. As she approached the line, Chief Chen stepped forward. He held out his Kestrel 5700X, a handheld weather meter and ballistic calculator that cost more than some used cars. It was a gesture of professional courtesy, an offer of a tool from one master to another he had just recognized. "Here," he said quietly, "in case you need it." Petrova paused and looked at the device, then at Chen's face. She saw the respect in his eyes, the silent acknowledgement. She gave him the smallest of nods, a flicker of appreciation. Then she gently shook her head, declining the offer. Instead, from a small pocket on her sleeve, she produced a single 6-inch strand of unraveled parachute cord. It was a simple, ancient tool. She held it up, letting it drift in the breeze, her eyes not on the thread itself, but on the way the individual nylon fibers danced and separated. It told her more than the Kestrel ever could. Chen watched, a slow look of profound understanding dawning on his face. He stepped back, humbled. He was witnessing something far beyond his own expertise. Anya settled onto the mat. She did not build a position. She flowed into it, becoming part of the earth. Her body was a study in relaxed tension, a perfect fusion of bone and muscle aligned to absorb the rifle's recoil. The scarred M40 seemed to melt into her, an organic extension of her will. The crowd was silent now, the mockery replaced by a tense, curious anticipation. They expected a comical failure, a complete whiff that would justify their prejudices. She addressed the first target. "Thread the needle." She did not use a laser rangefinder or a digital computer. She looked through her old inertal 10x scope, its optics clear but primitive by modern standards. She seemed to be counting, her lips moving silently. She was milling the target, using the reticle to calculate the distance. She made a single decisive click on her elevation turret. Her breathing slowed until it was almost imperceptible. The world seemed to shrink, to narrow down to the space between her eye, the crosshairs, and the distant target. The rifle cracked. The sound was sharp, brittle, nothing like the deep boom of Thorn's Magnum. It was the sound of pure efficiency. A second later, the ping echoed back, impossibly loud in the dead silence. Through the spotting scope, Colonel Vance saw the result. Not just a hit, but a perfect hole, drilled through the exact center of the previous one. A single, slightly wider hole. The crowd murmured. That was not a lucky shot. That was surgical precision. Next, the cold bore prophet, 2,000 meters. She didn't hesitate. Her head tilted, as if listening to a distant conversation. She was feeling the air on her skin, watching the subtle shifts in the mirage that were invisible to everyone else. She made a small, almost casual adjustment to her windage knob, a single click that seemed far too small for the distance involved. She settled, breathed out, and at the bottom of her breath, the rifle cracked again. The weight was agonizing. The bullet was in the air for over 3 seconds, a tiny metal messenger crossing a vast expanse of hostile atmosphere. Then it came, faint but undeniable. Ping, a direct hit, dead center mass. The silence on the range was now absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating thing. The operators were no longer watching a librarian. They were watching a ghost. Thorn stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief, the color draining from his cheeks. This wasn't possible. She was cheating. She had to be. But how? Finally, the ghost wind, the impossible shot. Anya did not even seem to look at the target. She lay there, perfectly still, for a full 2 minutes. Her eyes were closed. Chen, watching her, realized she wasn't looking at all. She was listening. She was feeling the pressure changes in the air, the way the ground vibrated under her mat. She was building a complete, 4-dimensional model of the battle space in her mind. The wind was a monster, a chaotic, thrashing thing. Then, for a fleeting second, a strange calm seemed to settle over the range. A lull, a moment of equilibrium between the warring currents. It was a window no one else could see, a momentary path through the storm. Her eyes snapped open. She moved. It was not a hurried motion. It was a single, fluid act of will. Her fingers squeezed the trigger in the exact instant the window opened. The rifle fired. The world broke. The bullet left the muzzle and began its impossible journey. It flew into the first valley, where the wind should have pushed it hard to the right. But she had fired into the lull, a pocket of still air that acted as a tunnel. By the time the round exited the pocket, it had passed the first crosswind. It entered the second valley, where the wind howled in the opposite direction. But her initial calculation, the single click of adjustment, was not for the wind itself, but for the Coriolis effect and spindrift that would be exaggerated over the extreme distance. The leftward wind in the second valley perfectly counteracted the bullet's natural rightward drift, keeping it on a miraculously straight path. It passed through the third valley's headwind, which served only to slow it down, making its final drop predictable. 3.5 seconds after she fired, a sound returned from the horizon. It was not the sharp ping of the other shots. It was a deeper, more resonant clang. The sound of a 175-grain Sierra Match King bullet hitting a 2-inch steel swinger target dead center with enough force to make it ring like a chapel bell. For a long moment, nobody moved, nobody breathed. The concept of impossibility had just been executed with clinical precision in front of 24 witnesses. The laws of physics had been interrogated, found wanting, and rewritten by a quiet woman with an old rifle. The silence was finally broken by a single, sharp exhalation. It was Chief Chen. He was slowly, reverently shaking his head. Gunny Thorne was a statue of shattered pride. His face was pale, his mouth slightly agape. The foundations of his world, built on the bedrock of his own perceived superiority, had been pulverized into dust. The excuses he had made now sounded like the pathetic whimpers of a child. He had declared the shot impossible, and she had made it look routine. In that moment, he was not a gunnery sergeant. He was a fool. Colonel Vance descended from the observation tower, his boots making no sound on the steel steps. He walked with a purpose that parted the stunned operators like a ship's prow through water. He did not look at Thorne. He did not acknowledge the other men. He walked directly to the firing mat where Anya Petrova was already, with the same calm, unhurried motions, beginning to clean her rifle, the barrel still warm from its extraordinary feat. He stopped a few feet from her. The entire range held its breath. Vance turned, not to her, but to the assembled group of men, his gaze sweeping over them, lingering for a fraction of a second on Thorne's ashen face. When he spoke, his voice was not loud, but it possessed a weight that crushed all other sound into irrelevance. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice cold and precise, "for the past week you have been in the presence of a master, and you have been blind. You measured a person by the volume of their voice and the shine on their equipment. You have been given a lesson today. I suggest you learn it." He gestured towards Petrova. "This is not Sergeant Anya Petrova. That is a temporary designation for an administrative cover, a cover I authorized so she could observe the decay in basic fieldcraft among our senior NCOs without the burden of rank." He paused, letting the words sink in, each one a hammer blow to Thorne's crumbling ego. "Let me introduce you to Master Gunnery Sergeant Anya Rostova." A collective gasp went through the Marines. Master Gunnery Sergeant, the highest enlisted rank. A rank of near mythical status held by only a handful of the most experienced and respected individuals in the entire Marine Corps. Thorne swayed on his feet as if he had been physically struck. Vance was not finished. He pointed to the old M40 rifle. "That rifle has a name. She calls it Vindication. She built it herself from salvaged parts over a decade ago. The doctrine you are all failing to master today, the manual on high-angle and complex atmospheric shooting. Master Gunnery Sergeant Rostova wrote it. She wrote the book. She is the book." He pulled a small, ruggedized datapad from his pocket and tapped the screen. A nearby digital display, normally used for scoring, flickered to life. It showed a heavily redacted operational file. The header read, "Operation Nightfall, After Action Report." "You want to know about impossible shots?" Vance's voice was now laced with a cold fire. 5 years ago in the Hindu Kush, a high-value target and his second-in-command were meeting in a fortified compound. A drone strike was ruled out due to collateral damage risk. A SEAL team was on standby, but insertion was deemed too high risk. The target was only visible for a 2-minute window through the gap between two buildings, at a distance of 2,475 meters. He pointed at the screen. Atmospheric pressure was low. The wind was gusting over 40 miles per hour. The shot was declared non-viable by every metric. An impossible shot. Rostova, then a gunnery sergeant, was attached to a forward operating base 3 clicks away. She disagreed. The screen changed, showing a grainy satellite image with a red line tracing an improbable trajectory. "With that rifle," Vance said, his voice dropping to an awed whisper. She waited for a single moment when both targets were aligned. She fired one round. That one round went through the left eye socket of the primary target and struck the second target in the throat. 2 high-value targets, 1 bullet, a shot the Pentagon still officially lists as a statistical anomaly, a 1 in a billion fluke. He swiped the screen again. A new page appeared. It was her confirmed kill record. It was not a list. It was a novel. The number at the bottom was so high, so far beyond the pale of even the most legendary snipers in history, that it looked like a clerical error. The room, which had been silent, went dead. It was the silence of a vacuum, the silence of minds that could no longer process the information they were receiving. Every man on that range, from the lowest private to the most seasoned operator, was a child in the presence of a god of war. Vance switched off the display. The sudden return to normalcy was jarring. He finally turned his full attention to the pale, trembling figure of Gunny Thorne. The bonfire was out. All that remained was a pile of cold ash. "Gunnery Sergeant Thorne," Vance's voice was flat, devoid of all emotion. It was the voice of judgment. "Your performance with a rifle today was adequate. Your performance as a leader was an abomination. You mistake volume for authority. You confuse arrogance with competence. You have fostered a culture of loud mediocrity, and in doing so, you have failed your men, you have failed this institution, and you have failed yourself." He stepped closer, his voice dropping so only Thorne and those nearest could hear. "You did not see a quiet professional. You saw a woman, and you dismissed her. You are a dinosaur, Gunnery Sergeant, and your time is over." The public execution followed. "You are hereby relieved of your duties as Chief Instructor of the Advanced Marksmanship Center, effective immediately. Report to my office at 1400 hours. Your next assignment will be to requalify on every basic rifleman course this Corps offers. You will start from the beginning. You will learn humility, or you will be separated from the service." He paused, delivering the final, crushing blow. "Master Gunnery Sergeant Rostova has graciously agreed to be your primary instructor for the duration of this re-education." Thorne could not speak. He could only nod, his eyes wide with a terror that went beyond the loss of his career. It was the terror of a man who has just seen the true nature of the universe and his own insignificant place within it. Then, Colonel Vance did something that would be spoken of in hushed, reverent tones at Quantico for decades to come. He turned his back on the disgraced Thorne. He faced Master Gunnery Sergeant Anya Rostova. He clicked his heels together, his back ramrod straight. He brought his hand up in a salute so sharp, so perfect, it seemed to cut the air. It was a breathtaking breach of protocol, a full colonel, a base commander, rendering a formal salute to an enlisted member. But it was not a salute to a rank. It was a salute from one professional to another, a bow from the establishment to true, undeniable mastery. It was the ultimate act of institutional validation. Rostova, who had finished wiping down her rifle's bolt, looked up. She saw the salute, saw the profound respect in her commander's eyes. She slowly stood, came to attention, and returned the salute with the same quiet, economical precision she applied to everything else. One by one, the other true professionals on the line followed the colonel's lead. Chief Chen's salute was as crisp as Vance's. The other SEALs, the Rangers, the senior scout snipers, they all turned and rendered honors. The junior Marines, their faces a mixture of awe and shame, clumsily followed suit. The entire range, once a temple to the loud arrogance of one man, was now a silent testament to the quiet competence of one woman. The legend of Rostova's Perch began that day. The story of the librarian who silenced the gunny spread not like wildfire, but like a change in the atmospheric pressure itself, an undeniable shift in the environment. The firing point she had used was unofficially cordoned off. A week later, a simple brass plaque appeared, bolted to the concrete. It read, Point 17, the Ghost Wind, Major General A. Rostova, one shot, one lesson. The M40, Vindication, was eventually retired, but not to a dusty armory. Colonel Vance had a special case built for it in the main hall of the Marksmanship Doctrine building. It was displayed alongside her simple strand of parachute cord with a copy of the Ghost Wind target, the 2-inch swinger with a perfect hole in its center. The exhibit became a mandatory stop for all new instructor candidates. The lesson was simple. Mastery is not loud. Rex Thorne reported to Colonel Vance's office at 1400, a broken man. The dressing down he received was clinical, brutal, and necessary. The next morning, he reported for duty. He was no longer Gunnery Sergeant Thorne, the boisterous king of the range. He was just Thorne, a student, dressed in clean but basic fatigues, standing at attention before Master Gunnery Sergeant Rostova. His re-education was grueling. She did not berate him. She did not mock him. In a way, that was worse. She treated him with a detached professional patience that was utterly unnerving. She stripped him of all his high-tech gear. He was given a standard-issue M40 and taught to read the wind not with a computer, but with a piece of thread. He was taught to calculate range not with a laser, but by milling targets with his reticle. He was forced to unlearn years of bad habits, of relying on technology to compensate for atrophied skills. For the first month, he was sullen, resentful. But he could not deny her expertise. Every instruction she gave, every correction she made, was undeniably correct. She would explain the subtle effects of barometric pressure on bullet flight with the clarity of a physics professor. She would have him shoot in the rain, at dusk in the snow, teaching him how each condition changed the equation. He began to see the world through her eyes, a world of complex variables and subtle clues that he had been blind to his entire career. The turning point came during a high-angle shooting exercise in the Virginia mountains. Thorne was struggling, his shots consistently missing low. He was frustrated, falling back on his old habit of blaming the equipment. Rostova walked over, her movements silent on the rocky ground. She did not look at his scope or his rifle. She looked at his position. "You are fighting the mountain, Gunnery Sergeant," she said, her voice quiet. "You are trying to force your body into a flat range position on a 40-degree slope. The mountain will always win. You must become part of it. Let the earth support you. Do not impose your will on it. Adapt to it." She had him rebuild his position from scratch, showing him how to use the rocks and the angle of the slope to create a platform that was both stable and natural. It was a revelation. His next shot was a perfect hit. In that moment, Thorne finally understood. True mastery wasn't about conquering the environment, it was about achieving a perfect harmony with it. It wasn't about the volume of your voice, it was about the quality of your silence. Rex Thorne completed his 6 months of remedial training. He was a changed man. The booming arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet, thoughtful confidence. He had been broken down to his foundations and rebuilt, stronger and better than before. Colonel Vance, true to his word, gave him a second chance, assigning him to lead a basic training platoon. Thorne became one of the most effective instructors at Paris Island, not because he was a legendary shooter, but because he was a legendary teacher of humility. His favorite teaching tool was his own story. He would gather his young recruits and tell them about the day a quiet librarian taught him that the most dangerous person on the battlefield is often the one you never hear coming. Master Gunnery Sergeant Anya Rostova remained unchanged by the fame she never sought. She politely declined offers of promotion, of medals, of public recognition. Her work was not about glory, it was about the quiet, relentless pursuit of perfection and the sacred duty of passing that knowledge on. Her legacy was not the impossible shot, but the cultural shift it inspired. A new generation of operators learned to listen more than they spoke, to value substance over style. The story ends where it began, on a hot day at the Quantico Range. Rostova was kneeling in the dust, no longer an outcast but a revered icon. She was with a young Marine, a nervous lance corporal who was struggling with his wind calls. The boy was staring intently at his kestrel, frustrated by the conflicting data. Rostova gently touched his arm, drawing his attention away from the screen. She pulled a single strand of thread from her sleeve and held it up. The wind caught it, making the fibers dance. "The machine gives you data," she said, her voice soft as the breeze itself, "but the wind tells you a story. You just have to learn how to listen." The young Marine watched her, his eyes wide with awe and understanding. He was not just learning to shoot, he was learning the language of mastery from the woman who had written the book. The legend was no longer just a story on a plaque. It was a living, breathing thing, quietly ensuring that true competence would always have a place and a voice in a world too often dominated by noise.